When warfare first started amongst the stars, everyone had no idea what they were doing. For most of it, it was simply large groups of ships launching all sorts of ordnance at each other. It didn't matter if it was ballistic, energy, missile, torpedo, hell, throwing a meteor at a planet was even considered fair game. And this led to many, many extinction level events across the entire galaxy, at least what was known at the time. This turned out to be a very small section, as only about a half a dozen species actually went to war with each other over territory. As it turned out, their home sectors were very close to each other, and this made them very nervous, thinking that one side would simply go after the other, so they figured, hey, might as well strike first. And this would lead to many, many civilizations either being completely wiped out or being knocked back to a time before tool use. However, this type of warfare did not last long when two more advanced groups faced each other. Due to Newtonian physics, it turned into simple slugfests of battleships, well beyond visual range, firing all sorts of ordnance at each other. Many tried to fly fighters in, but it was almost impossible to get there as the amount of point defense weapons, and of course guided munitions, would pick off most of the fighters before they even got close. In this case, fighters were simply used to extend a full barrage of missiles and torpedoes as far out as possible, and then fire them in at the same time. But this was a waste of resources, as all they did was spread out beyond the fleet. They did not go forward. They did not go back. As it turns out, the battleships were the king for a long time. More lighter and more devastating ships did come into play. Cruiser class, destroyer class began to put battleships through their paces. Yet it turned out battleships, being as strong as they truly are, could take a hit and still keep coming. That was until they met their match in the form of carriers. These carriers were loaded with tens, if not hundreds of thousands of drones. These drones would go in and swarm. Regardless of their losses, they would continue to their target and they would be able to land their shots. And this, in many cases, would disable a battleship long enough for the destroyers and cruisers to get close enough and land the finishing blow. However, in some cases, the drone swarm itself was enough to end the entire battle. And it wasn't long until this became the norm. The reason why drones were used was simply because the Newtonian physics would trash everyone to pieces. The amount of g-forces one would be pulling, the amount that they would be slammed against the side of their cockpit, they would be torn apart or crushed by the amount of force needed to make the high turns that were needed. Along with this, losing the personnel was not a factor, as casualties would mount very, very high in the battleships. Eventually, drones were used to control the battleships, and there was only a skeleton crew of maybe a half a dozen personnel inside a very, very secure area. This sometimes was several meters dense of their own material to block incoming fire. Though the ship may be destroyed or set adrift, they would survive. And once the battle in space was concluded, then it was on to landing on the surface. At first, this was done with dropping ground troops inside shuttles. They would bring them to the surface, but the losses again were staggering. It would be not uncommon to find 50% losses on the way down towards the planet itself. Of course, the resulting fall of the shuttle itself crashing into the surface would usually lend about 3 kilometers worth of dead zone underneath them, as the resulting explosion from the engines after the impact was enough to clear the area. So it was a coin flip, really, a choice. And since you were damned if you did or damned if you didn't, many of the folks on the ground decided that it would be in their best interest to just end as many of the ships coming down before they crashed and just ended all life in that area. But this was not something sustainable. Not to mention, on the ground, the improprieties of those who were on the ground were very noticeable. Many of them would beat prisoners, use them for their own nefarious or pleasurable activities. This was not something the civilians back on their home planet would ever want to be seen. Even hive minds could not understand this, as they were simply used for games that were very disturbing to watch. The hive mind could not understand why their own personnel were being ripped apart. The mind itself sometimes would have to sever itself from its own drones, as it couldn't possibly deal with the strange, disgusting, and painful acts that were being put upon it. Thankfully for them and the universe itself, there was only one hive mind that had to do this. All the others, it was their own civilian personnel, those who were non-combatants that were left to be treated poorly. Drones started to be used more often, as they could be sent down in higher numbers and there would be no loss of life on the drop. Along with that, those on the ground would also use drones, trying to protect themselves, as the birth rates were not nearly high enough to sustain the losses of life that was coming. As it turned out, the lack of empathy would cause some issues with the drones if they did find a civilian population. If they for some reason had a malfunction and believed the civilian population was a threat by any means, even a child holding a small piece of cloth for security, if it was perceived as a weapon, the drone would end everyone in that area, not stopping, running on seemingly sheer hate. But this was simple malfunctioning. Eventually, drones got to a point where they could actually decipher friend and foe, civilian and not, combatant and not, even able to decipher medical personnel, but not by symbols, but by the way they acted. The drones became the primary source of warfare, and as before stated, eventually entire armadas consisted of hundreds of millions of drones and about a dozen live personnel that would control all the actions as they simply looked on a screen and motioned for their drones to go this way or that way. The new rules of warfare after that were very simple. Mechanical armies or armadas would be used on both sides of the conflict. There would never be a choice between the two. But there was no massive loss of life. In this sense, this war would become much more civil, because if there was an opposing force that lost its fleet, they would simply cancel their campaign, and there would be a halt for 3 decades. No less. If they destroyed the fleet that was above the planet, it would be up to the aggressor whether or not they wanted to continue. However, this more often than not left the attacking fleet to be fairly decimated with not enough personnel, or in this case drones, to take down the entire planet. So what they would have to do is figure out a way to take down a planet simply, and the rules were decided as such. The planet would have its capital. Its capital, i.e. stronghold, on its area would be targeted. Not from orbital bombardment, no. What's considered a weapon of mass destruction or orbital bombardment would be completely removed from the equation. In fact, no ship even carried these weapons anymore, and they were limited to being showpieces in museums, as they were simply of no use to any of the ships, and they would rather use their mass for other items, as in more drones, more drops, more fighters, more anything like that. If the stronghold held, the fleet, once it reached a certain level of losses, would simply withdraw and again be limited to the 3-decade time limit. Along with that, this would show that even though they wanted to take the planet, as the planet itself was a great resource, they wouldn't be destroying exactly what they were trying to receive, or destroying the personnel on the planet in an indiscriminate campaign where they simply wiped everything clean off the planet and turned it into a worthless hunk of rock. That was against everyone's interest. However, on planets that had multiple continents, that meant there was at least one stronghold that had to be taken on each continent to secure the planet. Though only one of the planets they ever came across had more than 2 continents, this made the battle quite simple, as they would focus primarily on one stronghold, and once that was taken, they would move to another, simply moving the masses of their army, and realizing that there was no way for those on the planet to take the stronghold back. If the stronghold survived, again, they would break away. If they're able to take all the strongholds, those on the planet will become second or third class citizens to those of the conquering force. Essentially, they would be servants. Not quite slaves, but pretty damn close. If one was to actually try and use bombardment of any type, they would have to get within the atmosphere itself, down below the ionosphere, all the way into where there's actual atmosphere. This limited bombers to being aerospace bombers. They would have to be able to conduct themselves in and outside of an atmosphere, which made them large, bulky, and difficult to move. However, they were also rather durable, as they could take several hits from an energy cannon and still continue flying and deliver their payload. All they had to do was get within range, release the payload, and go away. The payload itself would usually fly for about 300 kilometers, which was usually the maximum of their ordnance. The only weapon that would seem to be the perfect use for this, as most of the armies would use drones, would be the EMP. However, the electromagnetic pulse does not work anymore, as each of the vessels themselves are shielded against such an attack. The attackers themselves, being attached to the ground, simply had to ground all their machinery, and then an EMP just wouldn't work. A simple wrapping of metal materials would send the electrons to the outside, down and around and away from the electronics. So it was, again, a pointless weapon. That being said, those on the ground sometimes would try to use an EMP to knock the larger ships out of the atmosphere. This sometimes worked, as being the fact that they must be able to fly, their armor is not as thick as they would like. Though durable, the fact that they would need excessively heavy materials to block from a directed EMP weapons means that EMPs are much more effective. That doesn't mean they're fully effective, as they're only about 21% effective in total. These were the new rules of warfare. And the attackers would withdraw if their attack dropped below 35% remaining of the original forces. I.e., if they lost 65% of their forces, they would simply withdraw and again be stuck with the 3-decade timeline. This type of warfare led a lot of battles and wars going back and forth for centuries, neither side truly gaining an advantage of another, though each of them seemingly building up more and more forces each time, more and more drones. However, the fact that most of their technology was being held in their strongholds, in their capitals, meant that much of their technology, most of their ability to build things, was simply destroyed, decimated, and removed from the surface, which meant a long time to rebuild, rearm, and get ready for the next invasion. In a few cases, there have been entire planets that have defended themselves effectively from multiple attacks. They have never truly fallen, and now their worlds are basically what's known as a fortress world. If you dare assault it, you will most likely lose around 90% of your forces before you even make planetfall. And because of this, very few times has their fleet even been attacked. Yet if you get close to the planet, the orbital defense satellites will usually be your biggest problem. If not that, the energy weapons that use the power of the planet itself as their energy source will cut through a fleet like it's absolutely nothing. The biggest of their battleships is useless at this point, which means that warfare is, again, evolving. It's evolving into using more smaller ships, meaning that if you take out their battleship, you're not taking out 50% of their forces. You would have to take out at least 30 or 40 of their cruisers before you even got close. That's not to mention their destroyers, their frigates, their corvettes, even. It was in one case that an entire military came in nothing but frigates and corvettes, and were seemingly laughed at by the defending forces. The defending forces were not laughing, as these ships simply blew through and in between their own battleships and just kept running towards the surface, totally bypassing the fleet itself and heading straight towards the stronghold. And before anyone even realized it, before they could even arm their main cannons, that fleet was making planetfall. It was insane to see them run the line like this. Though they did lose at least 12% on the way down, they still managed to get 88% of their own forces on the ground, and that was more than adequate to take the stronghold. The only issue was they were told that they could not do this again, simply due to the fact that the civilians did not have time to make it to the bunkers. Though it was stated that that was not within the rules, there was no time limit. And of course, that time limit was given later on. Because, as everyone knows, it's not a war crime the first time. That being said, things changed dramatically as one of the species that had started to expand its borders outward away from those that were hostile stumbled across this strange area. They heard different noises, different sounds coming through their communication devices. It was difficult to understand. Who the hell uses this band anymore? It was strange. Every once in a while, they would get blips of communication through this area, but it was difficult, if impossible at all, to decipher. But now they had a target. They saw that there was this strange third planet from the sun. Was that another civilization that they could conquer and plunder its area, its entire sector for resources? How many slaves would they have? 7 billion. They began to slobber over their jowls at the idea of not only having slaves, but a new food source and a new workable planet, one that was suitable for their own biology. They wanted this planet. They wanted the personnel. They wanted the resources. The gas giants themselves were worth more than 3 fleets. So they would simply take it. So plans were made, and by their own rules, they simply got ready to jump in, but they would simply tell the others, tell those that were waiting on the planet, you have 1 hour. 1 hour. That's all you had to get ready, because the drones were coming. The drones were coming, and they should get their own drones ready to fight, because that is the way civilized warfare is done. They did not want massive loss of life. They wanted to simply take them under their wing. But these were not polite words given at all. The words, when translated, simply came down to surrender and become our slaves. We desire your planet. We desire your personnel. We do not want to kill you all. Prepare mechanical. This was confusing to those on the ground, as they were having difficulty understanding the languages, the nuances, but they realized something was wrong. And immediately calls went out to every single force across that planet to prepare. Something is coming and they don't know what. But the attackers who were coming had no idea what was waiting for them on that little green and blue rock spinning around its star. Within 1 galactic hour of sending the declaration of war, the fleet jumped into the system towards that strange blue and green ball that floated in space. This was strange to see, but stranger still was the fact that when they arrived with all weapons primed, ready to fire at the fleet that would be waiting for them. But there was nothing. Nothing was there. Nothing floated in space except simple debris. The stray asteroid, a comet way out far enough that it couldn't be possibly a threat. There was nothing. There was simply a small protective almost shield in the way of an asteroid belt. On further inspection, they saw that two planets had seemingly collided and created this asteroid belt. Boy, this was a strange sector to be in. As they continued to get closer, which took several more standard hours, they saw something, or the lack of something, that was also strange. There was no defense satellites. There was satellites, yes, but most of them were seemingly communication satellites. They didn't have any defenses, save for one or two of them, and their weapons seemed to be pointing in the wrong direction. It was very odd to see. Along with that, none of the satellites, as they got close, set out their own sentry drones. This was amazing. The command crew couldn't understand what was going on. The captain constantly scratched at their antennae as they wondered what in the holy hell was going on. What in the ever-loving maker is going on here? It shouldn't be this simple. If this keeps up, they should be able to make landfall with 100% of their forces. And if that was the case, well, there's no way they could lose. With that, they sent down the standard decree that they would be taking over the planet. And on the way down, they believed nothing would be more simple than taking this whole world. However, there was a small issue. The issue being is that there are multiple continents on this planet. 7, in fact. 7 entire continents. This was never seen anywhere before. They didn't understand what was going on, so they began to scan to see where the primary base was, where the capital was, where they would find the fortress, where they would find the holdouts. This was incredibly important, as they would need to take out the stronghold to force the surrender. As they scanned the surface just before the invasion, they realized that there was multiple strongholds all over each of the continents. How was this even possible? No one ever did that. Did they know that they were coming? Did these creatures of this planet know they were coming? They couldn't. They don't even seem to be a spacefaring race yet. How could they possibly have seen it? Looking at it, they realized that out of the 7 continents, one of these must be the largest one, must be the one they aim for. And if they can't find the largest one, then the one centrally located, or the one most populous, must be it. So, they began to send down their groups, splitting the fleet into 7 sections. This would actually make the forces smaller than attacking a single group after facing a fleet, as they would still have 100%, but now each of them barely holding 15. Now they went towards the surface, but believed that their drones would be able to sweep across the area without any issue. As each of the corvettes, frigates, and destroyers started to break through the atmosphere, the battleships were very short behind them. They had to wait until they were within the atmosphere before they could use their main cannons. This was galactic law. This was warfare. This was the way their convention was, and they would not even bend it a little bit, even for this brand new species that seemed to not know anything about galactic civility, and that the targets should only be the drones, and you never ever target the bridge of the ship. They knew this, so with full confidence they headed towards the surface. And as they began to break through the surface, several areas began to light up. Screaming at them was all sorts of sensors and warnings as different type of ordnance and aircraft began to get closer and closer. Some of them seeming to drop several different types of ordnance as they got close. They were well beyond visual range, and several of the drones that could fly within atmosphere and the aerospace fighters were simply launched to try and take these out. They didn't have much of a chance to actually stop them, as these things were so large and so fast. They came in screeching towards each of the destroyers, frigates, and so on. And as they crashed in, there was a mighty fireball that burst the ship into many, many, many pieces. They didn't understand what was going on. This did not play out exactly around the entirety of the globe, but out of all 7 of their targets, at least 6 of them were being covered in aircraft. And with that, there was ordnance coming from the aircraft that seemed to be flying and guiding its way in. They couldn't understand. sending the drones basically to protect them. Many of them were cut to pieces and just knocked to the side by this ordnance as it came in, smashing into the side of another destroyer, and the destroyer simply fell apart several pieces as it plummeted to the ground, taking all its drones and everything else with it. The crew realized that they needed to bring out the big guns. Though as they saw more of their cruisers and destroyers be blown to pieces and plummet towards the surface, they realized they had to expedite this very quickly, as their percentage of losses was climbing exceptionally fast. With that, the order was sent, and all the ships that were already in the atmosphere simply turned their noses towards the ground and fired their engines, trying to get to the ground as fast as possible. In some cases, this made the ordnance coming in simply miss, but not always. The ordnance that was coming in would change direction, sometimes instantly, and crash in, taking another one of their ships down with it. This was astounding. But the attackers believed that they had the ability to take out whatever was coming. They pushed their own battleships faster towards the ground, and then suddenly realized with a massive jerk as they began to fly towards their own ceiling that something was off. The sensors kicked in and they realized this was a high gravity world. If they sent their ships in too fast, they wouldn't be able to pull up. They sent the message to all their drones to pull out of their dives and land as fast as possible. Unfortunately for some, this did not quite make it. Some simply crashed straight into their target city, and they simply exploded, knocking over several buildings in the process as they screeched in, all of them firing their weapons as they came in, some firing their retros as they tried desperately to slow down. A few were able to actually successfully flip and burn, and in some cases were able to slow down enough to simply roll over and land. This is what the opposing force wanted. They wanted to get their own forces on the ground as fast as possible. And as they staggered to their feet, trying to handle the extreme pull of this planet's gravity, they realized that much of their forces had finally reached the ground. The very first to be reached, was the largest and most dense city they could find. They looked on their map as they looked through all the GPS data they could, and they realized that the humans called this Mumbai. It was an extremely dense area. It was extremely populated, and this would be an issue. They looked, and it didn't seem to have a lot of defenses, yet for some reason there was a lot of machines moving in. From the shoreline, they could also see vessels moving in. This was odd. Did they send their drones outside of their protective zones? These creatures are strange. But the attackers believed that their forces would be unbeatable once they disembarked. The ramps immediately dropped, and drones began to crawl and roll out. Some on tracks, some on wheels, some on legs, but all of them armed, targeting anything they could. Anything they didn't perceive as a threat was left alone, but anything that even thought to be a threat was simply fired upon. With that, a bunch of drones were walking down the street as they saw something large and metal heading their way. They didn't know if this was a threat or not. But as they looked over, those in charge saw that another ship had landed, another group had landed, this time in Kensan, in the Republic of Congo. This landed with a bit of a thump, as the ground itself was not directly designed for this type of pressure. Many of it skidded to a stop. Some of the forces where they landed simply sunk down into the area. Some of it was wrapped up inside the foliage as they tried to get down. As it reached out, and it seemed as though the trees, as they swung back and forth, would grab onto the stabilizers and simply pull them sideways. The drones, unable to comprehend what was going on, would not be able to compensate before the ship itself would crash into the ground, not destroying the ship, but simply immobilizing it. With that, the command staff was worried about the rest of them. The ones that were sent to the southern continent seemed to face absolutely zero issue. The small colonies that were there were barely more than small huts. They believed this would make it easy for them to take, and they were right. The only issue they had was the fact that they were not ready for the extreme conditions, as it was the winter time in that area. As soon as they shut off their engines, the drones had no idea what they were in for. As they disembarked, they realized that a lot of the fluids used inside the drones began to simply freeze. The walking drones were the first ones, the rolling were the second, and those on tracks didn't make it back to the ship to try and warm back up. Many of them tried to overheat their systems, trying desperately to get their systems to work again. But the joints, the gears, everything was frozen. And with a massive amount of wind pushing them over, this was a losing gamut. They looked further and they saw that another continent had been landed. This strange looking island they call Australia. They landed almost on top of this odd amphitheater looking device. And they began to blast forward. They didn't realize that this was going to be one of the worst areas, as not only were the locals a little bit ready, but those who were not running away were running towards them. Were these threats? With that, another set of signals just off the coast, and they saw that several other vessels were already on their way. Wait a minute. Are those vessels drones or not? It doesn't matter. On their vid screens, they were shooting and blasting away. This was something they were worried about. More and more of the guided ordnance went up and started smashing into the side of those landing ships. The ships that had not made planetfall yet were trying desperately to support those that were on the ground, yet they faced more and more issues. They tried to get on the ground to get below the ordnance that was flying, and some of them just didn't make it. The command staff, still tucked inside one of their own battleships, was quickly trying to lower itself down to one of the areas they believed would be easier. They looked closer, and they could see that there was two continents joined by a tiny sliver of a landmass. If they were going to be able to make it, this is where they were going to. As the ones on the southern area tried to land, they began to check the map, and as that one touched down, they saw it was something called a sepalo. They couldn't pronounce the name. It was in a country that had a very easy name to pronounce, as it was the name of the captain's daughter, Brazil. They thought this was kind of funny and would be simply easy, but as their ships landed, they realized that they were facing more issues than they thought. As the doors opened, many of the drones were simply cut apart as many ballistic rounds began to cut through each of them. They couldn't understand where it was coming from. The drones were trying desperately to find anything, but there was so much movement around that it overloaded their sensors. They couldn't figure out where the shots were coming from. Many of the drones simply would lose a leg or lose a track or simply get blown in half or worse. The ones inside the command battleship aimed for the northern sector. They were going to aim at one place they called Oklahoma City. They couldn't understand the name and were having a lot of trouble dealing with the language. They had trouble because their multiple mandibles would not allow them to say this right. However, when they landed, they believed that this had to be it. It was centrally located. It was a major city. It was all built up with steel and concrete. This had to be it. As they made their way down, they didn't realize what shitstorm they were heading for. As they finally got down halfway through the atmosphere, they were hit with so much ordnance that most of the command crew was knocked right out of their seats and crashed into the side walls. Into the bulkheads they went flying, and into the consoles they crashed as well. Many of them hitting commands on their consoles that they weren't supposed to or didn't want to, causing the ship itself to drift and list in one way, or causing a few of the other destroyers and cruisers to simply do something strange. In one case, it accidentally shut down all the drones in one area. Forcing a quick restart, they quickly found out that almost 15% of their drones had been neutralized in the approximate 2 minutes from the time of realizing what had just happened to getting everything restarted. It was absolute chaos. Landing, they could see all the fighting happening down below. They tried desperately to get their battleship to the surface, using its larger weapons to fire down into the stronghold. They believed that they could take this one. This one was far away from the rest, had a smaller population density. At least if they took this one, there would be a foothold on this planet. But as they finally went down, they might realize that they might have fucked around and found out something very bad, as dozens of guided munitions crashed into the side of their battleship, launching it from side to side. Eventually, ground fire was reaching up and striking with just as much, if not more, force, and then it came screaming down. The crew, for the first time in decades, felt something in a battle they had not felt before: fear. The fear as their ship plummeted towards the surface. Their helmsman was able to pull out of the dive and slide the battleship to a stop, ripping off all the ventral guns in the process. But they didn't care. They immediately deployed as many drones as possible. But as soon as their ship stopped, they were already starting to be hit with some sort of ground fire. Something was coming over the hill and striking down on them. They couldn't see anything. They tried to use their point defense systems to fire up at the aircraft that were coming in, but none of them came in close enough. One of them tried, and then seemingly shot some sort of smoke out of the nose. And before they realized what happened, multiple rounds punched through the battleship like it was paper and ripped all the way to the ground. They realized at this point that they were not going to be able to get the ships off the surface. They tried desperately to tell all the battleships to lift off, get the hell off this rock. They were desperate, looking for anyone who could lift off, possibly to come and get them, as they knew they had to get gone. Only one ship was able to lift off, the one that was over in that strange island. But that strange island, its inhabitants had come out and started using melee weapons. They had to change all the civilians to hostiles before the drones actually began to fight back in earnest. But even as they did, they began to look on the video feed, and at first it was something odd. They couldn't figure out what was going on. And then they realized something simple. As one of the drones was knocked off to the side, its camera was still operating. It looked up, and they could see others of this species running over. They paused the video and couldn't believe it. Their drones, their standard drones, only came up to the knees of this species, maybe a little higher. They were massive. This species was gigantic. Even their dreadnought drones were only about the size, or maybe 80%, of the standard that they were seeing. These dreadnought drones had massive cannons, but these cannons were able to fire 4 or 5 times, but they were immediately targeted. Some of them would swarm in with melee tactics. Some would grab a hold of a drone and throw it at this juggernaut. Some of them would stand off at a distance and use their own ballistic weapons to blow it to frickin' pieces. They were now petrified, and many of those inside the citadel of this battleship began to not only shake but lose control of themselves and faint. They could only watch as around the world a single battleship tried desperately to reach beyond the atmosphere, as they realized that they could get into safety if they got out of here. But the high gravity of the planet meant that it was moving very, very slow, even at full burn. Just as it got halfway out of the atmosphere, tragedy struck as more of the guided munitions came in, but this time they could see that those aircraft were coming in much, much closer. Some of them deciding to use their ballistic weapons attached to them. This was madness. They looked over, and sure enough, they paused the video again, and they could see that these were not drones. These were manned. These were controlled by these monsters, these giants. This world of giants they had come to conquer, but they had no idea. They had not set up enough reconnaissance, and in their haste had doomed an entire invasion force. In fact, due to the fact that there were 7 continents, they doomed multiple invasion forces. On the ground, the humans used everything at their disposal. Their bare hands, sticks, guns, cannons, Molotov cocktails. It didn't matter. If they could find a way to use a weapon, they did, to smash these little robots to pieces. Many of them laughing while they did it as they kicked one over and started to raise their hands up straight into the air, palms together, fingers extended, and yelling something strange. Touchdown! They couldn't understand what the hell was going on. How could they have missed this? How could they not know that the biomechanics on this planet would have allowed for giants like this? No other species known to them was this large. And now they had their ships. The crew inside was shaking uncontrollably as the ship itself began to be torn apart. They could see through the exterior cameras several of these massive bipedal beings walking forward, many of them dressed all in the same type of clothing, though clothing was very rarely used for other species. It was clear that this was some sort of protection. They looked and they could see this creature bring out some large piece of metal, seemingly jamming it inside the ship as it shook as it hit, and then began to push down, and the metal itself began to creak and rip open. Eventually, these brawny hands reached and ripped the side open with a mighty groan, and the crew was exposed to the light. The light burned them, as they were not used to this high of intensity of sunlight coming down. It burned, and they tried to hide themselves. One of these bipedals, surprisingly, raised up its arm, moving its clothing to the side to shield them from the sun's rays. Realizing that the UV radiation might be toxic, it simply looked down. This is what we're fighting against? These little... Okay, this is hilarious. As the crew was brought into interrogation, it took a while before translation was started, and at that time, the ships were being cannibalized. The drones were being pulled apart to see how they tick. And of course, the computer core, which unfortunately for the invaders was not wiped clean, was being analyzed. Everything was now there. Their history, their science, their technology. And now these giants, these beasts that simply threw away caution and moved in. One of them sat on the other side of a strange metal, what they called table, and simply looked at him. The captain, being afraid that he was now separated from his command crew, as they were each obviously going to be interrogated, was surprised to be treated with such respect, as they were not tortured, they were not killed, they were not forced to divulge any information. The one in front of them simply started by asking a simple question. What the fuck were you thinking? The chambers of the Galactic Council were abuzz for several days, as everyone knew what was coming, but no one truly knew what to expect. When they looked out, they could see a massive ship moving towards the Galactic Council. The Galactic Council itself was on the largest space station available, and it was almost dwarfed by the majesty of this ship. This lone ship moved, with dreadnoughts flanking it on the left, right, dorsal, and ventral, and yet they almost seemed like pebbles compared to it. It moved slowly and deliberately, the ugliest damn ship any species had ever seen, and simply floated up close to one of the bays, and then extended its umbilical to latch on to the side. The entire station shuddered when the umbilical clamped on, and then the entire station could feel the air pressure as it was filled with atmosphere. They worried what could possibly had built a ship designed to take on entire planets and fleets alone. Who or what could possibly do this? They knew what it was. They didn't know exactly who, though. They wouldn't know until the council began to start. As they all looked outside the dome that was completely transparent, they could see the edge of this ship. It was clear to everyone in the chamber that whoever was there to make a statement. A very clear statement. The council chambers settled down eventually, and they were called to order by the chancellor. The chancellor introduced everyone to a new species that had been talked about amongst all others, but had not actually introduced itself. They were allowed to bring 2 of their personnel in, and as they were introduced, they were stated as being the humans. As the doors opened, many people wondered for a moment as there was no movement on the side. Eventually, one of these creatures, seemingly having to crouch almost down onto its buttocks to make it through the door, wiggled through with some difficulty, and then stood up to full height. Its height almost pushing its head against the top of the council chamber itself, at least at the entrance. Then, as it stepped forward, another one came through, the first one being dressed in plain garments. Though wearing garments was not common, it was clear that this was meant to show that everyone that they were clean and respectful. The second one came through with all sorts of shiny ornaments on the front of its suit. Along with that, it had a simple piece of headgear that was tucked under its arm once it stood up. Each of them walked up to the front and got ready to introduce themselves. The man in the suit spoke first. "Hello, I am Mr. Vanskoy. I am representative of the human race. This here is Fleet Admiral Chartier. He is here to represent the military arm of the human race. And now that introductions are over, we'd like to get down to business." The Fleet Admiral stepped forward and laid out the events. "As you all know, approximately 14 of our years ago, one of your species showed up on our homeworld, declared war, and immediately came into our space. Granted, there's a slight difference in the way time moves in our space compared to yours, so we did not have the allotted time that you would suspect. Your standard of a galactic hour is approximately 51 minutes of our time. You gave us 34 minutes. This is well documented, and you should all be receiving a report as I speak. During this time, you entered our sector, going beyond our gas giants and working your way towards. As we are come to find out, you have been looking for our fleets. At the time, we did not have a fleet, not one designed for what you were planning on. Our satellites were neither designed to reach out and strike you, nor to scan your ships at the time. However, due to this, you decided that the jewel of Earth itself was something you wished to take. Your hubris, your desire to take down our entire population and turn us into slaves, something that the human race has had to deal with over our own history for a very long time, and we take very much offense to." With that, Vanskoy reached out and touched the Fleet Admiral's arm, reminding him not to get any type of emotion into his speech. Clearing his throat, he continued, "As you know, your fleet, your forces were completely and utterly destroyed, eliminated, beaten, and then fell down to our planets. We found out that you had decided to send an envoy to our planet demanding the return of those ships. We have checked your decrees, your laws, your way of thinking, and found that there is absolutely no precedence for this. We need to return nothing. They are spoils of war, just as any other conflict written in your own guidelines. We also know that you once on the losing side, are to hold yourselves for 30 years, 30 of your years, which barely comes out to 20 of our own. Because we have no wish to destroy another one of your fleets and have its whatever was in those fleets damage our planet again, we have come for peace negotiations. He lanes it over to Mr. Vanskoy. Yes, thank you. As my wonderful friend, Fleet Admiral Chartier, has said, we have come for peace negotiations. The whole crowd is now rumbling, talking to themselves. As you know, we have not reached beyond our own crater world, as of what you know. Though we have found that bringing in a common enemy can very much aggravate our population. To that end, we would like to quell this by not only bringing peace, but also, once reparations are paid, we will simply retain ourselves in our own sector. Do not violate our territory, and we will not have any issues with you. Mr. Vanskoy looked around and let everyone rumble around that for a moment, as many of them were still amazed at how large this giant was and how eloquently it spoke, even though the bellowing voice was something that made those right up front have to cover their audio receptors, trying desperately to make sure that they do not go into a coma from the booming sound that was coming out. With this, the ambassador for the Clunk, the ones who actually invaded human space, jumped up. How dare you even consider this? We will not pay you. And plus, you must return our ships, or we will never have peace on your planet. Why should we possibly return a spoil of war? Because it is the right thing to do, and because we have told you to do so. Telling someone to do so does not make it law. We have checked over your documents, as he held up a datapad. We have seen what you have signed as a signatory of your laws and rules of war. We do not have to. However, being that we are not a signatory, we are asking for a special exception to this so that we do not engage ourselves in your galactic conflicts as we have no interest in them. Still, how dare you even consider defying what's ours? We can consider that because we kicked your ass. They all looked at each other, wondering if something had messed up in the translation. If you do not do as we command you to do, then we will simply invade you again, but this time we will bring 10, no 100 times as much forces. There is no way you can defeat that many, even with your large stature. There is no way in all of the hells there are that you could possibly fight against that much force. Plus, since you are not a signatory, there is other weapons we can bring to bear. With that, the entire crowd got very nervous, as they knew what he was implying. We don't recommend that, the fleet admiral said. Mr. Vanskoy held his hand out slightly, trying again to calm the admiral down, but the admiral was clearly not happy about the situation. If you do not listen to our decree in this council, you have gone in defiance of this council. You are not the council, Mr. Vanskoy screamed. You are simply one species, but we are the strongest voice. He looks around to all the council members, and you will see that none of us will ever bow down to you, never be your toys, never, ever will we ever be your servants. We know that you are a threat to every single one of us, and due to that, we will all come together to fight a menace such as yourself. Menace? Mr. Vanskoy asked. Yes, absolutely a menace. You bring that ship, you bring a dreadnought-class ship to this area of peace, the only area in the entire galaxy where no weapons are to be brought, and you brought a dreadnought, something designed to crack worlds, and yet you claim that you want to be peaceful with this show of force, a threat to everyone here, every species, every colony that is out there. Every single one of us knows how dangerous you are. We understand that you do not have the capability yet to reach beyond your crater world except for this one ship. And we also know that there is no way that you can stand up against all of us. You are a threat to everyone here. This time, swaying not only his claws, but his tentacles on every single direction, trying to emphasize the fact that he is bringing everyone together. And Mr. Vanskoy and the Fleet Admiral can see that he is swaying every single one of them as they are beginning to lash out, waving their different appendages in their different ways of being incited into violence. You will see that the wrath of all the species of this council will be more than you can handle. We demand now that you surrender quietly. You will surrender not only that dreadnought out there, yourselves, but also your entire species, and you will serve under the Galactic Council as fourth-class citizens. Fourth class? Mr. Vanskoy asked. I don't think fourth class is going to... I did not ask your opinion, you overgrown oaf. You ogre that is standing here threatening us. Standing there, how do we not know that those decorations are not weapons that you have? The Fleet Admiral pointed at his ribbons. These? Yes, they are disgusting. You are simply trying to show dominance above all. And we will not be persuaded. We will not be scared. We will not be denied our right. And our right is that entire sector of yours. Your sector will be taken by everyone here. Your resources and personnel will be taken and split up amongst us all. You will face the wrath of the entire galaxy if you do not bend to us and give unwavering fealty to us now, here and now. The two humans seemed unimpressed, mostly because they towered over everyone in the chamber. The only one they even seemed to look almost eye to eye was the chairperson, as they were, or whatever they were, was elevated above all else. Only about the height of Mr. Vanskoy's chin, though. Mr. Vanskoy jumped in, saying, Before we do this, I would like to introduce you to our laws and rules of war. He hit a few buttons on his datapad, sending the message to everyone. This is the rules we go by. We recommend that you sign this. We have prematurely signed this. However, it will be dismayed and dismissed if you consider not signing it. You come here again threatening us and want us to go by your rules of war. You have no idea. Do you have any idea how much we have sacrificed to make war civilized by using our drones? This civilized warfare is beyond your possible comprehension, and you do not understand the power that this has. We will rain all sorts of fire on you, and we will destroy every single one of you and put the rest in bondage. The Fleet Admiral took his small datapad, put it in between his hands, and snapped it clean. This scaring the crap out of almost everyone in attendance as they saw the sheer power of who and what they were looking at. However, before he had a chance to say anything else, Mr. Vanskoy jumped in. Then what do you propose would be the outcome of this war? Full annihilation? We will simply do as I have stated before. Your men will be taken as worker slaves so that we can build our societies even better. Of course, we can all agree that it would be great to have one of these monsters raising up all of our debris, making sure that we can build our towers and our skyscrapers much larger, much bigger, and much faster. Of course, this got many of those in the council chambers who were driven by nothing but greed to cheer even louder at the idea. As for your children, they will be forced to indoctrination. If they refuse, they will be slaughtered like any other who face off against us. And as for your females, well, I'm sure we can find a use for your females. Perhaps your younger ones will be much better, as they won't be fully grown yet, and then we can. Mr. Vanskoy is actually holding his arm in front of the Fleet Admiral, as the Admiral was about to just lunge at the clunk. With that, I believe negotiations are over. It's a damn shame, isn't it? It's a damn shame. What is? It's a damn shame, it's a damn shame. It's a damn shame. They continued to say this as they walked out the door. But before leaving, the Admiral said back, "War is something we're very good at. We've been killing ourselves for several millennia. And guess what? Our wars are not so civil." This threat was met by a whole bunch of hisses and screams and curses and throwing of different items at the door as the Admiral was barely able to squeeze through the doorway and headed back towards his ship. As they did, the rest of the council began to cut off into groups and started to call forward for each of their fleets to be ready. Every single one, even their defense fleets around their homeworld, would be mobilized to take out the humans. They wanted to do this. They wanted to end this threat before it became beyond anything they could control. They realized that anyone who was friendly with the humans would be unstoppable once the humans were on the ground. As the human ship unbuckled from the station once again shifted and bounced in one direction, knocking many people off their feet. Well, people being a euphemism. And as the ship began to turn, some didn't realize what was going on. All they could hear through the comm system was a whole bunch of voices as the ship began to turn more and more in the opposite direction. It's a damn shame, isn't it? Yep, it's a damn shame. And as the calls went out for each of the fleets, suddenly fusion drives they didn't even know were actually on this ship were ignited, scorching the entire station, turning it into a molten piece of slag in a matter of a few seconds. Most of those inside didn't even have time to scream as the walls buckled. The station itself lurched to one side, shoving many off to the side so fast that they would crash into the bulkhead and be crushed under the pressure. The station itself began to list and then flip from all the pressure that was going on. The outer ring was completely scorched and melted off, venting most of the atmosphere. As those who were inside desperately tried to find some way to breathe, they were constantly being rotated and flipped and tossed around, and they would die slow as they ran out of atmosphere to breathe. The few that got to the escape pods, as they were standing right next to them, were the only ones who could tell the tale. The humans were coming, and they seem pissed. After the show of force that humanity had used during the initial contact with the Galactic Senate, many of the representatives were left without their heads of state, and this made many of them angry. How dared the humans hide a weapon? But it was soon realized that that was not a weapon. That was simply a backup engine. As the ship itself did not move on anything but gravimetrics, why would they need a fusion drive if they worried the gravimetric might fail? There you go. However, as everyone knows, a fusion drive lets off a lot of heat and a lot of force. This was enough to destroy the station, at least half of it, leaving the rest to simply choke, as most of their atmosphere had been drained out in a matter of a few moments. 14 different species decided to take whatever arms they could and jump towards Earth. They wanted to make sure that these crazy giant hairless monkeys were going to be done with as soon as possible. They jumped in with hundreds of thousands of ships, and times thousands of that in drones. But as they jumped into the system, a system they believed they would have an easy time crossing, they found something they were not ready for. Earth had not been idly by. Even though time changes very differently inside the soul sector, for whatever reason it might be, and they did not have nearly as much time as anyone thought, the humans had not been idle. Everything was ready. Ships wrapped around not only the homeworld, but also around its satellite Luna. On the surface of its moon, it had multiple stations ready with weapons pointed out, each of them ready to fire. The ships began to send their own fleets of drones, and it seems as though some of them were specifically designed to carry as many drones as possible. These drones whipped through space with a speed they didn't even think was possible. The opposing force sent everything they could, but many of their weapons simply bounced off the drones as the hulls were reinforced and so much larger. Many of their own drones were sent as kamikazes to try and stop Earth's forces from cutting through them. But it was nothing. Earth's forces simply got close, fired their primary weapon systems, whether that be an energy weapon or a ballistic weapon, but also launched a bunch of torpedoes. These torpedoes decided to go straight into the enemy ships, bore themselves to the center, and then explode, needing far less concussive force to rip one of these ships to pieces. But the opposing force was not completely stupid. They had brought their biggest, their baddest, their meanest, their most I'm gonna fuck your face up type ships that they could. And they fought their way through the drones, each time getting more and more agitated. Even though there was only a handful of biologicals on each of the flagships, it didn't matter. They sent everything they could, trying to coordinate as best they could, but for some reason they couldn't seem to knock out the humans' fleet. The drones would come in, fire one volley, release their torpedoes at point blank range, and then simply dip, dive, dodge, and duck the whole way back, dodging all sorts of indirect and direct fire. It was strange. It was as though this AI did not want to get destroyed. Where the opposing forces, the AI, were simple. They would fly in straight and true, and they would line up their shot perfectly, and they wanted precision over anything else. Though what they saw coming from the human ships was nothing less than nightmare fuel. As they were dealing with the drones and moving as fast as they could towards the home planet, cutting right through the asteroid field, not even caring about the other planetoids, not even giving the first flip of a fart what is going to happen. They are fighting their way through no matter what. Suddenly, some strange bursts came from the flagships of the humans. They didn't think of it too much, but then alarms went off, and moments later, large pieces of metal would shoot right through their largest ships. Sometimes they would simply skim across the surface, ripping large swaths off the side. Other ones would punch through, going stem to stern, taking out the crew in the process. Others would hit the ship, causing it to buckle, bend, and in some cases snap in half. What the hell was that? Was all they could think of. But they had a mission. They had to destroy this dangerous adversary no matter what, and if it took their lives, they would take these humans down. Fighting forward, every human captain and crew said the same thing. They got some balls. Ain't gonna save them, though. With that, they switched from their long range to mid range, firing all sorts of torpedoes, missiles, and using their energy weapons, which can only be used for a short time before completely cooking themselves. So they had to use them very sparingly. They had mastered the ship design by taking apart all the ships that were left behind by the initial invasion. As the phrase goes, if you fail in your invasion, you only sharpen the spears of those you wish to conquer. And with this, the humans had learned. They had reverse engineered with an alarming rate. and added their own technology onto these ships. As they got closer to the planet, trying to drive right through the blockade that was humanity's fleet. They were catching fire from satellites, from Luna itself, all the drones, and as they got close to the ships, they tried to use broadside cannons, which were almost never used, but these seemed to almost refract or bounce off the sides of the human ships, especially those that were of battleship class or higher. They started to wonder what was going on, and then they heard laughing through the comms. That strange human sound that made them all riddle their quills in disgust. That's not a battleship, you idiot! With that, they were confused. How did the humans figure out their communications? What do you mean, not a battleship? The big guns, that's a frigate. With that, intermixed with the human fleet, still fighting for their lives, they realized they might have just dove into the lion's den without realizing what they had done. But they still had a mission. They had their orders, and they were going to take out part of humanity if that meant they were going to crash their ships on the surface, and that is exactly what they did. Humanity was screaming at them to turn back, telling them to leave Earth alone, to sign the peace accords. They will overlook everything if these 14 species would just go away. But no, they crashed down on the planet, many of the ships barely able to raise their nose before plummeting right into a populated area. The reactor systems exploding across, in some cases leveling several kilometers in every direction with antimatter burst. This was enough to make humans exceptionally pissed. And on the surface, any drone or God help them, any biological being that happened to make it to the planet would realize that the surface of Earth was now nothing but a kill zone. It was now a fortress world. At one point, it was a paradise world, but now, looking at the way it was designed, and also knowing the god awful flora and fauna is there, it was more than Fortress World. It was hell. On the surface, aircraft screamed overhead, some of them drones, many of them piloted, dropping all sorts of ordnance on the ships that were there. On the land, all sorts of machines made their way through, all of them firing weapons as soon as they got within range, and or over top, being called in as lobs of shells came over more and more and more, coming in 2, 3, 4 at a time. Again, another 2, 3, 4 hitting, and then they would hit dead center, ripping the entire ship to pieces or the entire nest of drones. On sea, it wasn't much better, as a few of them landed on the ocean and sent many of their drones up towards the shore. What they found was nothing less than horrific. The ships that were close by, if they had any weapons, they began to fire, blasting the drones, forcing the water to get in on the delicate circuitry, and then they would simply short out and plummet to the bottom of the ocean, where they would simply die. The humans seemed to laugh at this, as some of them seemed to be placing bets, raising beverages for every single one of the drones that was destroyed. As one of what they call Navy ships came in, it began to fire with such veracity and firing so many guided munitions that most of the systems could not keep up. The 14 species that showed up came to conquer. They never left. Their bodies and their ships are now strewn across the entire Milky Way, as many of them plummeted towards the planet, burning up on the way in. Humanity realized that this was not going to be a war that would be simple, and if they did not do something, they would be completely overrun eventually. But that decision was not made by the military, no. As it turned out, when they ran the line with their massive ships, they deliberately aimed for the biggest population centers they could. 28 major cities had been hit by a kamikaze strike by one of their battleships. And when their reactors blow, it's worse than a nuke. First, there's the explosion of antimatter as the containment field fails. It blows out just like any other nuke, but it doesn't quite have the same heat. It does have, however, a strange radiation that will mutate you worse than radiation it will. It is horrific. But then there's the implosion, which is far worse, because it will then draw in everything around it, pulling it into a micro black hole, and if it reaches critical mass, it will explode again, and this time leaving nothing on the surface. And if any living creature is within the radius, which is 7 times larger than the actual concussive radius of the explosion, mutations happen. Most of these mutations will cause humans to start writhing in agony on the ground, as most of their intestines will basically melt inside their system. Some started growing extra fingers, extra eyes, but their bodies would not compensate, and suddenly 2 eyes in one socket would crush and explode, causing much blood to flow into their brain as they slowly died from subdural hematoma. It was horrible to watch this. Some of them grew multiple muscles, some of them muscles disappeared. In some cases, humanity actually became stronger. And this, again, is what the opposing force did not understand. Not only had they sharpened the spears of humanity, not only had they once again stoked the fires of hatred, but now they have made humanity much stronger than they already were. And humanity was looking for a fight. As they began their counteroffensive, this would be several years later, the fleets divided amongst all the different other races, all 78 of them. They began to head out to each of these civilizations with their battle groups, and they would not stop. When they reached the colonies, they were given absolutely no quarter. Humanity had lost so much. Billions of its own personnel died from these strange mutations, not to mention the explosions. Lord only knew what had happened to their world, the one shining jewel that they had held on to. Many of their own soldiers and sailors had died already defending. And now they had brought war again, and this time humanity would bring a type of warfare to them, and it would be called total war. With this, each of the battle groups rushed in and would blitzkrieg the defenses, tearing them to pieces and letting them drop on the colony world or the home world it might be. After that, they began to strike everything they could, ripping out all their satellites, all their ships, everything without hesitation. While this was going on, they simply had their own defense fleet fighting off other species that came in large groups. And with the fleets divided, this would be much more difficult. But humanity was ready for a fight. And this time, they wanted blood. Because as the war drug on amongst the other homeworlds and colonies, Earth had been struck over a half a dozen more times, and each time millions more personnel were killed. Men, women, children, indiscriminately. The drones that reached the bottom didn't discriminate between anything and began just slaughtering everyone. And in one case, they saw that the ship had released right next to a high school and a primary school, both on opposite sides of the road. The drone, even though it released its little drones from the ship, which was a drone itself, maneuvered its guns and began to blow away any possible means of escape. All the vehicles were immediately shot, all the aircraft were shot at, and the buildings were beginning to be leveled. Anyone that ran was swarmed by the small drones, and all the children were ripped to pieces. If they were shot, they were the lucky ones. If not, the drones would simply come up with their small legs, jump on them, and shove spikes through them, meleeing each of them to death. Many of the small children, not knowing what to do, simply froze and were gunned down. Even with the smaller ordnance, it didn't matter. These were children. And this let the last bit of humanity die. The fire that was empathy was gone. Apathy took its place. Humanity and its forces were numb to this now as they went through and began to fire on each of these forces. Though they had been able to stop all the forces engaging on Earth outside at the enemy's homeworlds, they would begin to fire down on each one. They would use everything: orbital bombardment, chemical weapons, biological. It didn't matter if they had to nuke the entire world. They were going to end this. They left many worlds as nothing but floating cinders in space. If they didn't seem to put up any type of resistance, if they simply pulled their fleet back inside the atmosphere and hid, and if they were not one of the ones that had attacked Earth, humanity would be the slightest bit careful. And they would simply shoot down all the drones, remove the satellites, the fleet would be gone, and then the infrastructure would be taken apart. Every bridge, every power station, every water treatment plant, it didn't matter what it was. They sent them back to the fucking Stone Age. But that was only if they were drug in by the other species. All in all, 45% of the Xenos, of the initial Galactic Council members, of course, were left in the Stone Age. The rest either choked to death on chemical and biological agents, dying of blisters or blood pouring out whatever orifice they might have, burning under nuclear fire, learning the hard way that orbital bombardments can be precision warfare, as their hidden bunkers underneath their mountains were simply skewered from the top. The total war of humanity left none alive. Yet they saved a single species to the very end. The same species that had invaded Earth without any hesitation and decided that they would threaten everyone, that they wanted to take humanity as slaves for pleasure, for simple abuse, and to take the jewel that is their world. This was the Clunk, and they had pulled back their forces, leaving the rest of their allies to fight for themselves, but now they faced humanity alone, and like any other bully, they tried desperately to plead, saying they were not being serious, they were just kidding, they didn't truly mean it, please, you don't have to hurt us, please, we are sorry. Well, sorry doesn't bring our people back. Sorry doesn't take the radiation and the antimatter burns off our world. Sorry won't save you. With that, the Clunk sent everything they had against the human fleet. The human combined fleet was now absolutely massive and well trained. The drones never had their memories wiped and were learning computers, so they were just as hard to take down as some of the basic fighters you would find. Anyone right out of flight school would have difficulty facing them, although an ace could still take them down. But this the Clunk didn't understand, nor did it truly matter. As hundreds of thousands of drones filled the air, along with capital ships getting ready to unleash all sorts of hell, the Clunk released their trump card and used their own planet's power against humanity. They had learned. They had seen these same type of cannons down on Earth themselves and had been busy building up their own world. To humanity's dismay, they worked. They worked and they took out several ships. Though these ships were only destroyers, it was clear that they had the ability to reach up and actually hit the capital ships. And with that, the Clunk actually demanded humanity's surrender, because they would not take the Clunk alive. Humanity's response was simple. Okay. The clunk didn't understand, but they would very soon, as every single ship fired all their ballistic weapons down towards the surface. The gravity of the planet simply grabbed the ballistic rounds and dragged them towards the surface. Each of these ships began to fire indiscriminately down towards the surface. From the northern to the southern pole, they simply covered it and began to fire, letting the planet itself rotate as they continued to fire. And as they saw that there was no ships left and no cannons left, they simply got themselves closer and began to scorch that planet with their own energy weapons. They burned over a half a kilometer deep into the planet's surface, causing many volcanic eruptions. Any bunkers that may have been on that planet were simply flooded with fire from either above or below. And at that point, humanity had its vengeance. Humanity had its fill. And humanity wanted the one thing that all warriors want once the battle has been concluded. They just wanted to go home. Humanity, as a group, went back to Earth. Mars, Venus, Luna, Io, all the planetoids, all the satellites were being colonized by the end of the war. Humanity was now spreading out to the stars. They knew this would be a long and arduous process. Everyone knew that eventually humanity's guns would aim towards itself once again, maybe a few decades down the roads, but for right now, the guns would be silent, and all of humanity breathed a sigh of relief. It was over. Deep in the blackness of space, those species that survive still tell tales to this day. Some are pulling themselves up by their bootstraps and are able to get themselves back into space, while others are still in a meager agricultural existence, basically subsistence living, as they have not been able to get themselves back to where they were. But they all say the same thing: don't fuck with the human. Because when it comes to war, one thing they're not is civil.